Major League Baseball hands down its punishments for the Rays and the Yankees, and it doesn't quite add up. Several surprise teams are still in the playoff race, and the Giants and the Braves made history with huge offensive outputs in recent days. Hello, everyone. I'm Chris Brown, and welcome into this Thursday, September 3rd edition of Around the Bases from 110 Sports. As always, streaming live at 110sportsmedia.com/live, twitch.tv/110sports, and available on demand on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and on the website. And we do have a lot to talk about today. The dust has settled now a little bit from the trade deadline, so we'll take a look at the postseason picture right now and much more. But before we get to our top four for today, and before we even get to our rundown, I do want to start with this news because it is major and sad news in the baseball world right now. Tom Seaver, the greatest pitcher in New York Mets history and one of the best pitchers ever to play Major League Baseball, passed away yesterday at the age of 75. In a statement from the Baseball Hall of Fame, Seaver's family announced that he died of complications from Lewy body dementia and COVID-19. His daughters, Sarah and Ann, and his wife, Nancy, in a statement saying, "We are heartbroken to share that our beloved husband and father has passed away. We send our love out to his fans as we mourn his loss with you." The hard-throwing right-hander known as Tom Terrific won an MLB best 25 games in 1969, taking home the first of three Cy Young Awards and leading the so-called Miracle Mets to an improbable World Series victory. Hank Aaron called him the toughest pitcher I ever had to face. Over his 20-year career with the Mets, Reds, White Sox, and finally the Red Sox, Seaver won 311 games with a 2.86 ERA and 106 wins above replacement, all while recording 3,640 strikeouts. He ranks 18th all-time in Major League history in wins, 6th in strikeouts, and 7th in wins above replacement. Seaver was an All-Star 12 times, tossed a no-hitter with the Reds in 1978. He led the NL in strikeouts 5 times, won 3 ERA titles. He struck out 200-plus batters in an MLB record 9 consecutive seasons. His 10 straight strikeouts during a game in 1970 remains an MLB record. Seaver is the only pitcher in the divisional era with 250-plus wins and a career ERA below 3.0. He's only one of only 10 pitchers ever with 300-plus wins and 3,000-plus strikeouts. He was elected into the Baseball Hall of Fame in 1992, receiving what was then a record 98.8% of the vote. In a statement, Major League Baseball Commissioner Rob Manfred called Seaver one of the greatest pitchers of all time and a gentleman who represented the best of our national pastime. Manfred saying Seaver, quote, was synonymous with the New York Mets in their unforgettable 1969 season. After their improbable World Series championship, Tom became a household name to baseball fans, a responsibility he carried out with distinction throughout his life. On behalf of Major League Baseball, I extend my condolences to Tom's families, his admirers throughout our game, Mets fans, and the many people he touched. A sad day across Major League Baseball, sad evening yesterday, and again today, as one of the best ever to play the game, Tom Seaver passes away at age 75. And we're going to go ahead and make the turn now. It's not an easy turn to make to the rest of our topics for today. There's no easy way to do this, of course. But we're going to go ahead and shift gears now to our other topics for today and dive right into our rundown of what you can expect here on the rest of today's broadcast. We're going to start, as always, with our top four. Actually, we got straight away from that on Tuesday's show, but we're going to get back to that today. We're going to talk about the suspensions that were handed down for the Yankees and the Rays, really just one player, two managers suspended, but some confusing... I don't quite understand what happened there with baseball and its length of the suspensions there at all. So we'll talk about that. Plus history for the Giants, Braves, and Cardinals with huge offensive outputs. Some surprise teams who are still contenders at this point. It's September 3rd. And at some point I can't just keep writing off these teams as, oh, they'll regress. It's September 3rd. We're in the home stretch. And especially with this season, it's not going to take a great record to sneak into the playoffs as that 8th seed necessarily. So we'll talk about some teams that are still hanging around as contenders at this point of the season, plus one team that's not, that everybody expected would be. Finally, we'll end our top four with It's September and, which is a couple players I want to highlight where it's September and X player is, leading the league in OPS and stats like that. We'll talk about that briefly. We'll go through our news and notes as always, dive into some midweek standouts, some recent performances that have been really impressive. We'll take a look at the current postseason outlook now that the trade deadline is in the rearview mirror. We're entering the final month of the season. What does the postseason outlook look like in both the American League and the National League and division specifically? There's some interesting, in looking at playoff odds, it looks like some things might be a little bit more set than we might realize. So we'll talk about that. And then, as always, we'll end the show with a preview of some of the big series coming up this weekend in what's on deck. So let's go ahead and start our top four for today with this, the latest episode of the now multi-year feud between the Rays and the Yankees. Involved some dangerous actions, some strong words, and now some suspensions. On Tuesday night, Rays infielder Joey Wendell believed it was no accident that Masahiro Tanaka hit him with the pitch in the first inning. 8 innings later, in the 9th inning, after that had all been bubbling under the surface, Yankees closer Aroldis Chapman unleashed a fastball over 100 miles an hour, which would have almost certainly hit Rays infielder Michael Brousseau in the head had he not been able to duck out of the way just barely. And then the game ended, the Yankees winning 5-3. After the game ended, the benches cleared in a post-game confrontation. And that was certainly enough on its own. But then Tampa Bay manager Kevin Cash, who was understandably frustrated about the situation, he only made things much worse in a post-game press conference saying, that he has, ending his press conference essentially saying he has a whole group of players that can throw 98 miles an hour, which, number one, showing, potential retaliation. And it sounded, people were saying that this is like a threat. I mean, it's not something to take lightly, saying you got a bunch of guys who can also throw really fast 100 miles an hour, and potentially hurt someone. I mean, it's dangerous rhetoric, undoubtedly, to say the least. Yankees manager Aaron Boone responding to that, saying that the comments were pretty scary and he didn't think they were right at all. On Wednesday, Major League Baseball responded as well, quickly handing down a 3-game suspension for Chapman and a 1-game suspension for both Boone and Cash. All three individuals were also fined. Cash and Boone served their suspensions last night. Chapman is appealing his. And that's all the basic information you need to know about this situation. But here's the problem that I, and clearly many others, have about the suspensions here. According to Major League Baseball, Chapman's suspension was, quote, for intentionally throwing a pitch at the head area of Brousseau. And for that, he got a 3-game suspension. Meanwhile, the Dodgers, their reliever Joe Kelly, received an 8-game suspension, which was later reduced to 5 games for throwing a pitch, quote, in the area of the head of Alex Bregman, and then later taunting Carlos Correa. That's MLB's explanations for the suspensions for both players. And I understand that there are some differences in the situations here. For one, there's really nobody out there who's doubting the intentionality of Kelly and throwing near Bregman in that situation before, several weeks back. And I understand that there's more room for someone to potentially think Chapman's pitch was unintentional. Major League Baseball was also understandably trying to set a strong precedent with Kelly, in not having pitchers take things into their own hands with dangerous actions and throwing near Astros or at Astros players. But I don't understand why baseball isn't applying the same logic in this case, because the reasons listed for the suspensions for Kelly and Chapman are the same. Again, they're both about the explanation for why they were suspended was exactly the same, with the only exception being that Kelly was also cited for taunting Carlos Correa. And that's certainly not, I'm not going to buy that is a logical reason why he got so many more games in his suspension. That doesn't make sense. So I don't understand why there's a difference here. Because according to baseball, in their statement, Chapman's pitch was deemed intentional. So why are they applying a different punishment? I guess the only explanation is, probably like I said, it's not as clearly intentional. But I just don't feel like you can go middle ground on this. Like it's you either find it's intentional and you give that harsh punishment, or you don't. I don't see. I know baseball's trying to find that middle ground. And to be clear, I'm not pointing this out to say that Kelly's suspension was too harsh, because throwing baseballs nearly 100 miles an hour near someone's head is extremely reckless and dangerous, and someone is going to legitimately get extremely hurt or worse one of these days. But I don't get MLB's inconsistency here. I don't understand the logic. I also, to note, I also don't understand Kevin Cash and Aaron Boone both getting a 1 game suspension. I'm not entirely sure what Aaron Boone exactly did, other than that the managers often, will get punished for the actions of their players, which, they're responsible for their team. But Cash's words were really dangerous in themselves. It sounded a lot like a threat. I mean, that those managers need to be held to a high standard. And Cash's rhetoric, like I said, not acceptable at all. And for him to be receiving the exact same suspension as Aaron Boone doesn't add up to me either. In the end, it's not going to matter all that much. I realize that. And the Rays defeated the Yankees 5-2 last night to end the regular season series between the two teams. No major drama in that game. Tampa Bay holds a 4.5 game lead over the Yankees for the AL East lead. There's certainly tensions between those two teams, like I mentioned. The regular season series between these two clubs is over, but they could certainly square off again in the playoffs. It'll certainly be something to watch if that does indeed happen. Again, this isn't anything that I think is the biggest deal in the world, but I just think baseball needs to be consistent, and there needs to be something. I just don't feel like the standards for punishment here are consistent at all. And again, like I said, I'm not saying that because I think the situation wasn't handled well, because he deserved strong punishment. But then if the same conclusion was reached here, the same punishment should be here. That's the general point. So we'll move on here to our second top 4 item today. And that's history for the Giants, Braves, and Cardinals, kind of grouping 3 different teams with offensive outbursts of different varieties into one point here. And we'll start with the Giants. On Tuesday night at Coors Field featured a remarkable game between the Rockies and the visiting San Francisco Giants, who scored in the first inning, and then in the second inning, and then in the third, and then in the fourth, and you get the picture. They scored in every inning except the ninth, tallying a whopping 27 hits and scoring 23 runs for a 23-5 victory. The ninth inning, the only one in which the Giants got shut out, was pitched by, of course, Drew Butera, the Rockies' catcher, because, of course. Middle infielders Donovan Solano and Brandon Crawford for the Giants each had 6 RBI, as did left fielder Alex Dickerson, and we'll talk more about him in a minute. But first, I want to just touch briefly on the team side of this. The Giants' 23 runs were the 3rd most allowed by the Rockies in team history. Those 23 runs and 27 hits were the most for the Giants in a game in exactly 30 years. The Giants also became the first team since RBIs became an official statistic back in 1920, 100 years ago, to have 3 players drive in 6+ runs in a game. I mean, that's a lot of numbers, a lot of stats, but first time ever for a team with 3 players with 6 RBIs or more in a game. I mean, that's incredible. And now let's talk a little bit about Alex Dickerson. The 30-year-old is in his 4th Major League season. He'd never even had a multi-homer game before. And he hit 3 home runs Tuesday night. And almost 4. With 3 home runs already in the books, he had a 414-foot double in the top of the 9th. And as MLB.com's Sarah Langs noted, it would have been a home run in 29 MLB ballparks, all but Coors Field. All but Coors Field. He would have had that 4th home run, something few players have ever done. But he didn't need that fourth home run for it to be an incredibly historic night for Dickerson. With that double, he became the first player in Giants history with 5 extra base hits in a game. He had entered the game with just 6 extra base hits all season. The last time a Giant even had 4 extra base hits in a game, Barry Bonds at Coors in 2002. It was just the 12th 5 extra base hit game in MLB history, and his 16 total bases for Dickerson tied the most in a game in Giants history with Willie Mays back in 1961. I mean, what a performance. What a performance from the Giants, who they have an offense much better than anyone expected. We'll talk about that a little bit more in just a few minutes. But let's go ahead and move on to the Braves. And speaking of 3 home run performances, last night the Braves outfielder Adam Duvall hit 3 home runs against the Red Sox at Fenway Park. It was the first time a Braves player had hit 3 home runs in a game since all the way back the night before, when Marcell Ozuna did it. Marcell Ozuna hitting 3 home runs on Tuesday night at Fenway. And according to Stats Inc., Ozuna and Duvall joined Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig as the only teammates in MLB history with 3 home runs in games on back-to-back days. Joining Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig as the only teammates in MLB history with 3 home run games on back-to-back days. Oh my gosh. Ozuna became the first NL player with 3 home runs in a game at Fenway Park. Also the first NL DH ever with 3 home runs in a game. And Ozuna also homered last night. He had 4 home runs in the series, as did Duvall. It's just the second time ever that 2 visiting players have had 4 or more homers in a 3-game series at Fenway in a season ever. It's a weird stat, but it's just more proof of how historic this is. Ozuna having a great season, his 12 home runs now, just 1 behind the MLB leaders. He only got a 1-year contract this offseason, and it's certainly working out well for the Braves, no doubt. And finally, we'll shift now to one more offensive outburst. The Cardinals defeated the Reds on Tuesday night by a score of 16-2. The Cardinals bounced Sonny Gray from the game. He's been one of the best pitchers in the NL this year. They bounced him from the game in the first inning in the shortest start of his career. The Cardinals became this is a really kind of a weird stat, but see if you follow along here on this one. The Cardinals became the first team to face a starting pitcher with a sub 2.0 ERA on the road and win by 14 or more runs since the Orioles back in 1967. The Cardinals' 23 hits were the most in a game since 2008 for them, and the most of any team at Great American Ballpark in Cincinnati ever. So some history for the Giants, for the Braves, and for the Cardinals in recent days with some huge offensive outbursts, 3 home run games, and more. So go ahead and shift here now to our third top 4 point of the day. And that is, as I teased, some surprise teams that are still in contention, and one team that's surprisingly not in contention here entering the month of September. And we're going to start with the Detroit Tigers, who prior to an 8-5 loss to Milwaukee last night, they had won 6 games in a row. They're now 17-17 on the season. It's not a great record by any means. But with a wider playoff field, you don't necessarily have to have a great record to make the postseason, and teams that are around 500 are most certainly in the playoff race. And while Detroit is in 4th in the AL Central, in a competitive AL Central behind the Indians, White Sox, and Twins, they're the first team out of the playoff field as the season ended today. And as for the how they've been somewhat competitive this season, it's not the pitching staff. Their ERA for the season for the team is 28th in the majors, but Detroit has been a surprisingly competent offensive team, and much better than competent. They've been 5th in the American League in OPS, 4th in batting average, behind some of the best AL teams. And we'll talk about Jonathan Scope a little bit more in a minute, but first baseman Jeimer Candelario is hitting about 300. Outfielder Jacoby Jones having a great year, though he's now out with a broken hand. I don't see this continuing for the Tigers. As far as them, the this being I don't see them really finishing the season with a 500 record or better. I think they're gonna fall off here. I just don't see the talent, but who knows? I mean, stranger things have happened. This is 2020. The playoffs are have a biggest playoff field we've seen here, and we're in the final month of the season. So, got to give credit where credit is due. And the same should be said for the Marlins, the second team I want to highlight here. They're also at the 500 mark right now. They're 16-16. And if the playoffs ended today, or pardon me, if the season ended today, the Miami Marlins would be in the playoffs. Now, as we talked about on Tuesday, the Marlins dealt Jonathan Villar at the trade deadline, but acquired the top hitter who was dealt prior to Monday's deadline in Starling Marte. More on him coming up in a minute as well. And Miami hasn't been good offensively. I mean, Starling Marte is a big boost to that lineup, but there's not a lot around him. They haven't been great offensively. But they've got a great deal of young, talented arms. Pablo Lopez, Eliezer Hernandez, Sixto Sanchez, three players you probably haven't heard much of anything about. But they posted 2.1, 3.2, and 2.4 ERAs, respectively, this season as starters. Sixto Sanchez only made a couple of starts, but this is a team that really deserves some credit for their ability to develop young arms, and they're going for it. And there's something to be said for that. Of the three teams that I'm going to highlight, the Tigers, Marlins, and then the Giants coming up, the Marlins are the one that, even though I'm not buying them as a great team or a playoff team in a regular scenario, they're the team that I am the highest on. And a big reason for that is the pitching staff. Something that the Tigers and the Giants don't have is that pitching ability. And the Giants are that third team I want to highlight here. They're 18-20, so below 500 by a couple games, but they're the first team out of the playoffs on the NL side right now. Gabe Kapler's club has won 10 of its last 14 games, and we talked about their offensive explosion the other night, but their team offense overall has also been much better than anyone could have expected. They posted the 6th highest OPS in the National League. They're trailing only the Dodgers and the Padres in runs scored this season among NL teams. That's right, the Giants have scored the third most runs in the National League this season, behind only the Dodgers and Padres. Mike Yastrzemski, Donovan Solano, Evan Longoria, Brandon Crawford, Wilmer Flores, they're all producing at a pretty high level offensively for this team. Some of those aren't huge surprises. Some of them are pretty big surprises. The pitching hasn't been so great. A lot of starting pitchers on that roster with ERAs in the mid to high fours, but nobody's been a disaster. San Francisco didn't trade away pieces at the deadline like they have in recent years. They think they've got a chance, and with that offense looking like it is, I mean, sure, they have a chance. I don't see it happening. I'm not predicting it, but it's not a zero chance, and, in this strange season, it's not really costing them that much to just play this out and see how it works out. One team, as I have here, on the graphic, I wanted to highlight as one team that is a surprise team that is not in contention. And what I mean by that is it's September 3rd, and this is a team that is not really in contention at all. And it's a surprise that it's September 3rd and this team's not in the race at all. And that's the Washington Nationals. The defending world champions have, by record, been one of the worst teams in baseball this year. They've now been held scoreless in 2 straight games. They've lost 5 in a row. They've dropped 10 of their last 13 games. There's certainly talent on this roster, to be clear. Juan Soto and Trey Turner have been and are one of the best 1-2 punches in the majors, but there's just no offensive support around them. Steven Strasburg's out for the year, the rest of the season. Max Scherzer and Patrick Corbin have been pretty good, pretty darn good, but not great, and like with Turner and Soto, there's not much great support around them. And that's the problem. There's a great core right there. You say you got a team that has Juan Soto, Trey Turner, Max Scherzer, and Patrick Corbin. And that's a great core 4, but you got to have some support around them. And the Nationals just haven't spent the money or developed the players right now to have great support around that core 4. and it's really costing them. The Nationals are at the bottom of the NL East standings with a 12-22 record. I mean, it's just been bad for the defending world champions. And I saw some holes in that roster, especially on the offensive end, as far as depth. But I figured with that pitching staff and that talent at the top of the lineup, like, they would at least be pretty darn competitive. I thought that they would regress, and I didn't see them, making a really deep playoff run again, but I don't think anybody, including myself, could have expected this bad of a season from the Nationals to date. Final top four item I want to get to very quickly here. We'll just run through this real briefly. Is it's September and this segment comes from just time looking at the MLB stat leaderboard and sorting by all these different categories and just sort of observing and saying, oh, it's September 3rd and that player's still, you know, leading the majors in this, or second in the NL in this, or the best first baseman at this point in the season. So just want to highlight real quickly a couple things. It's September and a 21-year-old leads Major League Baseball in OPS, and it's not Fernando Tatis Jr. It is Juan Soto, who has 11 home runs and 6 doubles in 26 games this season. He's hitting .344, he's slugging .750, and his OPS is almost 1,200. He's been outstanding. Just sensational stuff from Juan Soto at the age of 21. The amount of young talent in the game right now, the amount of star players who are 21, 22 years old is sensational. It's September, and Yankees first baseman Luke Voit is tied for the MLB home run lead. He has 13 homers. He's hitting about 300. He's really emerged as one of the top first basemen in baseball. In his last 148 games played, which is this season to date, and all of his games that he played in last season, 34 homers, 90 RBIs roughly, and about a .270 batting average. This is a great player for the Yankees, than Luke Voit. It's September, and MLB's doubles leader is Tampa Bay shortstop Willy Adames. Probably a name you may not have heard of. Adames is hitting .322 with an OBP of about 400. He's been really good for the Rays and a big part of their offensive success this year. It's September, and Detroit infielder Jonathan Schoop is second among second basemen in OPS. He's been one of the best second basemen in baseball. Jonathan Schoop, the former top prospect with Baltimore, has fallen off in recent years, but he's finding success in Detroit. He's hitting .310 with 8 homers in 33 games. And finally, it's September, and Major League Baseball's on-base percentage leader is Cardinals first baseman Paul Goldschmidt, and it's not even really close. Many people were thinking heading into the season Goldschmidt was done as an elite hitter and that he's on the decline. And, that's probably true. His best days of his career probably behind him, his best season of his career behind him. But Goldschmidt's showing he still has something big left in the tank. He's hitting .337 with 3 homers, 7 doubles, 24 walks to 14 strikeouts in 28 games this year. And his on-base percentage is basically .480. Goldschmidt getting on base nearly half his at-bats. Nearly half his at-bats, half his plate appearances, I should say. The next closest is Bryce Harper, who's about at .440 on base. So there's a huge gap. Goldschmidt getting on base nearly half his plate appearances. I mean, that's been outstanding. So something I wanted to highlight as well. So that is our top 4 for today. A long top 4, getting to a lot of different items. Here to start our Thursday broadcast. When we come back after our first break of the day, we'll go through some news and notes, some interesting ones today, some relatively big items I want to touch on pretty briefly, and then we'll talk about some other midweek standouts. And that's a segment we have. I kind of started some recent standouts on Tuesday's show. It's just sort of a catch-all for some incredible performances, some players you need to know about that are doing incredible things. We'll discuss that, and then later in the show we'll take a look to wrap things up at a look at the playoff picture right now. We'll look at the playoff odds in each division and an observation about the American League postseason field being a little bit more set than we might all realize. So a lot coming up here today on the show in the second half of today's broadcast. Stay with us. We'll be right back. This is ATB Live from 110 Sports. All right, welcome back to Around the Bases from 110 Sports. As promised, we're going to get now into today's news and notes and then dive into some midweek standouts. So let's start with some news items, some pretty big ones today, some noteworthy news items. And we'll start with some good news. Oakland Athletics manager Bob Melvin telling reporters yesterday that the team has returned no positive COVID 19 tests since the one that paused the A's season over this past weekend, and the team expects to resume play on Friday. That is, of course, good news to hear. Major League Baseball announced its Players of the Month for August, and the exciting two teams, the Padres and White Sox, two of the most exciting teams in baseball, were well represented. In the American League, White Sox first baseman Jose Abreu was named Player of the Month. He hit 330 with 11 homers, almost 30 RBI in the month of August. His teammate, Luis Robert, the center fielder, was named Rookie of the Month for August. He hit about 300, 9 homers, 20 RBI. He was incredible in August, and one of the front runners, undoubtedly, one of just two players really in the running for AL Rookie of the Year at this point, along with Kyle Lewis of the Mariners. AL Pitcher of the Month, absolutely no surprise, it was Indian starter Shane Bieber, 4-0 record, a 1.63 ERA, 57 strikeouts in 38 and two-thirds frames. Reliever of the month in the AL was Oakland's Liam Hendricks, a 0.64 ERA, 9 saves in 14 innings in August. In the National League, as I mentioned, the Padres well represented. Fernando Tatis Jr., Player of the Month, 313 average, 11 homers, 24 RBI. His middle infield partner at this point in this season, Jake Cronenworth, who is the front runner at this point for NL Rookie of the Year, was NL Rookie of the Month. 355 average, 14 extra base hits in the month of August for Cronenworth. NL Pitcher of the Month was Yu Darvish of the Cubs. He's been sensational. 5-0 record, 1.09 ERA in the month of August. He's just cannot express how incredible Yu Darvish has been this year for the Cubs. Reliever of the Month in the National League was the Dodgers' Kenley Jansen, and this is a player we haven't talked too much about because he's looked in the decline. It looked like maybe this could be the year he loses his closer spot. Things starting to fall apart, but instead he's been incredible. 1.54 ERA in the month of August with 8 saves and 19 strikeouts and just shy of 12 innings. So those are your MLB Players of the Month for August that were announced yesterday. A handful here of some quick injury updates for you. The Dodgers placed third baseman Justin Turner on the IL with a hamstring strain. The Rays placed infielder Yandy Diaz on the injured list with the same injury, hamstring strain. The Yankees activated Zach Britton, the reliever from the IL. He had a hamstring strain. The Cubs activated Chris Bryant and Steven Souza Jr. from the IL and placed Jose Quintana on the injured list. The Royals placed veteran reliever Ian Kennedy on the IL with grade 2 calf strain. His season's likely over. The Cardinals placed outfielder Dexter Fowler on the injured list for precautionary reasons after he's now taking a medication for a stomach illness, which could lead to a decreased immune system. He's expected to miss a couple weeks of action. The Minnesota Twins activated Josh Donaldson, the veteran third baseman from the IL, after he'd been out with a calf injury. Former AL MVP, a big addition for them down the stretch. The Padres placed outfielder Will Myers and reliever Emilio Pagan on the injured list, and Charlie Morton and Walker Buehler returned from the IL to make starts last night. Both were good. Morton's start was pretty short, though. It wasn't cut short. It was just a short first outing back after a lot of time sidelined. Another transaction note for you here, just a week after acquiring him from the Mariners, the Blue Jays on Tuesday designated for assignment Daniel Vogelbach, a move that was made to clear room for their recent trade acquisitions, which included Robbie Ray, Ross Stripling, and Jonathan VR. ESPN's Kylie McDaniel reporting that the 2021 MLB draft will move from June into mid-July and be held in Atlanta as part of the All-Star Game festivities. Still a lot to be worked out there, including the length of the draft, but certainly making sense from a marketing perspective for baseball to be moving the draft to All-Star Week when a lot of eyes in the sports world are on Major League Baseball. Finally, the Pittsburgh Pirates announced Wednesday that the team will wear number 21 against the White Sox on September 9th. Every member of the team will wear number 21 to honor Roberto Clemente. And that's today's news and notes. We'll move on now to our midweek standouts. We've already discussed a number of great standouts, from Adam Duvall to Marcell Ozuna and several others. But I also want to hit on some other players who have been doing great things lately. It's just a kind of a catch-all segment, like I said, to highlight some great performances from recently, but also sort of highlight, great runs, like, a player with a great outing, and look, they've been having a great year and we haven't really talked about him. So that kind of idea. So we'll start by highlighting Milwaukee reliever Josh Hader, who last night made history in his team's win over the Tigers, striking out one in a 1-2-3 ninth inning, not allowing a hit. It was his 12th consecutive hitless outing, which is a new record to begin a season. It's not been completely smooth sailing for Hader this season, because despite the fact that he's given up absolutely 0 hits this year, he's walked 10 batters in 11 2/3 innings. So it's not been perfect, but wow. 12 consecutive hitless outings, a new record to begin a season for Josh Hader. Next player to highlight, Cleveland Indians starter Zach Plesac. And with Mike Clevenger traded to San Diego, Plesac, who was at the team's alternative training site after he'd broken protocols, he rejoined the Cleveland rotation right away after that trade and picked up right where he left off. 6 strikeouts, 1 earned run in 6 innings Tuesday against the Royals in his first big league start since August 8th. His numbers for the season now: a 1.33 ERA, a 0.67 whip, and a stellar 30-2 strikeout to walk ratio in 27 innings in 4 starts this year for Plesac. He's been sensational on the mound, no doubt about that. Another pitcher who's been great, another pitcher I want to highlight here who's been fantastic this year but not receiving a ton of attention, is Phillies starter Aaron Nola. Tuesday night against the Nationals, 8 innings, no runs, 2 hits, 3 walks, 9 strikeouts on 113 pitches. Nola now has a 2.45 ERA for the season. Heading into play yesterday, his 57 strikeouts were tied for the 5th most in baseball this year. Also entering yesterday, when I looked at the Baseball Reference leaderboard, he was 3rd among pitchers in wins above replacement, ahead of the likes of Yu Darvish, Zach Gallen, Lance Lynn, Trevor Bauer, Jacob deGrom. So Aaron Nola, he's been really, really good this year for the Phillies. Not a lot. I haven't talked about him much because his ERA hasn't been like as minuscule as some of the other, very top pitchers this year, but he's been incredible. A little bit of a down year last year, but make no mistake, Nola, one of the better pitchers in the National League. Another player I mentioned we would bring him up again, and that's Starling Marte. Remember, it was a really interesting trade deadline for Miami as they dealt away Jonathan Villar, but acquired the biggest bat moved at the deadline in Starling Marte. The 31-year-old veteran, longtime Pittsburgh Pirate, was in the midst of another strong season this year with Arizona. And then he, of course, got traded to the Marlins. And Miami in a playoff spot, as we talked about right now, clearly going for it, as the Marte acquisition showed. And he made a great first impression with his new team, breaking a 2-2 tie with Toronto on Tuesday with a game-winning solo home run in the bottom of the 8th inning. And he became the 2nd player in Marlins history with a go-ahead homer in the 8th inning or later in his Marlins debut, joining Miguel Cabrera. So great start for Starling Marte in Miami. Another player to highlight for you, Cardinals DH infielder Brad Miller, the 30-year-old, signed a contract, a 1-year deal with St. Louis this past offseason. He hasn't done much in recent years, but 4 years ago in 2016, he hit 30 homers with the Rays. This season, in a pretty regular DH role, he's been on fire for the Cardinals. And like their cleanup hitter right now. He tallied a career-high 7 RBI on Tuesday. He's hit 3 home runs in his last 2 games. He's got an OPS of over 1,100. He's been one of the better hitters on a plate appearance basis in baseball this year, and nobody saw that coming. That's Brad Miller. 2 more names I want to highlight for you. One of them is staying in St. Louis, and Kwon Hyun Kim, their starter, not a name you probably heard of much, He pitched in South Korea for several years before signing a 2-year deal with the Cardinals this past offseason. He'd been mostly a starter in his career, but he opened the season as the Cardinals closer with several relievers injured. But he then joined the rotation for the Cardinals again after their COVID-19 outbreak, and he's been lights out since. He's allowed just one earned run over 20 and a third innings as a starter, or 20 and two-thirds innings as a starter. He tossed 5 scoreless innings against the Reds on Tuesday, and according to Stats Inc., after his 5 shutout innings against the Reds, he now has a 0.44 ERA in his first 4 major league starts. And this is a really impressive stat. So, since ERA became an official stat back in 1913, the only lefty pitcher ever with a lower ERA in his first 4 major league starts, Fernando Valenzuela. It looks like the Cardinals might have found a really legit, high caliber major league starter in Kwon Hyun Kim. He's been incredible this year. Clearly, there's going to be some regression coming, but he's been sensational to open up his career starting in the major leagues. Final player I want to highlight here in our midweek standouts is Mets second baseman Robinson Cano, who at 37 years old, showing he still has something left in the tank. Cano is homered in 3 of his last 5 games. He's hitting .375 on the season. MLB.com's Anthony DiComo noting that Cano has a chance to become the 6th qualified hitter in the last 100 years, age 37 or older, to hit at least .360. Among the others who've done it, Ty Cobb, Ted Williams, Tony Gwynn, and Barry Bonds. So if Cano, there's a month of the season left, but he's on pace right now to join elite company as a 37-plus-year-old player who hits above .360. We'll see how that plays out the rest of the way, and hopefully he can remain healthy down the stretch for the Mets. And that is a look at our midweek standouts this week. A lot of players who went through their rapid fire, but wanted to just highlight some incredible performances, both of late and also some names we haven't talked about who are doing great things this season. So we're going to go ahead and take our final break of the broadcast. When we come back, we're going to go ahead and take a look a little bit at the standings across the league right now and the playoff odds, and about the playoff picture right now, what it looks like, how set is the playoff picture. It's very different from the National League to the American League. You think with the playoffs as open as they are, with 8 teams making it in each division, there'd be a lot of competition still entering the final month in both leagues. That's not necessarily the case. And I'll tell you what I mean by that coming up after this break. More to come here on Around the Bases from 110 Sports. All right, welcome back to ATB Live from 110 Sports. Streaming live on the 110 Sports Network, 110sportsmedia.com/live, twitch.tv/110sports. We're going to slow things down here for the final segment of today's show. We went through a lot today. We covered a lot of different topics. To begin the broadcast, a lot of different performances, a lot of different names, a lot of different players, a lot of different statistics. So we're going to slow things down a little bit here on our final segment and talk a little bit about the playoff picture as it stands right now. The trade deadline has passed, and that means we're in the final month of the season, unlike in a regular season context, a normal season context, where trade deadline passes July 31st. There's still 2 months left of the season. We are in very much the final stretch of the season. 1 month to go, yet also almost half a season to go because of the nature of this year. So not much time, but also a huge portion of the season is left. And so I wanted to take a look a little bit, now that the dust has settled, at the playoff odds and what the most likely playoff pictures, most likely playoff scenarios are at this point. And so we're going to break this down a little bit now. We're going to go through each league and each division briefly, and I'm looking at fan graphs because I really like how they lay things out. Baseball Reference has a method as well for laying out playoff odds, odds to make the playoffs, odds to win the World Series, win the wild card, win the division. We're not going to dive into it too deeply because that's leads us down a long conversation with a lot of different numbers. So we're not going to dive into the numbers too much. We're going to stick with sort of just playoffs numbers. We're not going to get into seeding here. I'm not going to talk, 1 seed, 2 seed, 3 seed, just making the playoffs. And let's start by talking a little bit about the National League, where things are still pretty open. And of course, one thing that's been assumed, one thing that people, kind of, it's your first inclination, logical to think, oh, the playoffs expanded this year. It's going to mean, it means, of course, more teams making the playoffs, but you think that means, okay, that means a lot more teams are going to be, it's going to be really competitive down the stretch for who makes the playoffs. Well, let's take a look at that. Starting, like I said, with the National League. There are 5 teams that have an 85% chance or higher of making the playoffs right now. In the East, the Braves are basically a lock. The Phillies have an 85% chance of making the playoffs. This is, again, all these numbers from Fangraphs. They're updated for today. In the NL Central, only one team, the Cubs, has a 98% chance. No other team with above 85% chance. And in the NL West, the Dodgers are a lock and the Padres are a lock. So that's 5 teams out of the 8 in the NL that are pretty much set. I should say 4 are essentially completely set, that being the Braves, Cubs, Dodgers, Padres. The Phillies look really likely at 85%. And then there's 3 more spots, and there's a number of teams vying for it. You've got the Cardinals with a 71% chance because they're likely to get that second NL spot. But there's a number of other teams that are in the mix, from the Brewers with an above 50% chance, 53%. The Reds still have a 40% chance, as do the Mets. The Marlins given a 30% chance. Out in the West, the Giants have, we talked about the Giants, a 42% chance, and the Rockies have 35%. So that's a lot of numbers. I said it wouldn't be a lot of numbers. I guess I lied. That's a lot of numbers there. But the moral of the story here is there's only 2 teams with a below 29% chance of making the playoffs in the National League. And 29%, that's the Marlins, isn't particularly high, but that's a sizable chance still. We're talking almost a third chance of making the playoffs. There's really only 3 teams that are not making the playoffs. That's the Pirates, the Diamondbacks, and the Nationals. And even the Nationals still have a 5% chance. So the National League, still, there's a lot to be decided in terms of what teams are going to actually make the playoffs. That's not so much the case in the American League, and that is the bigger point I wanted to highlight here. In the American League, there are 7 teams with a 96% chance or higher of making the playoffs. Essentially, 7 of the 8 teams that are going to make the playoffs in the AL are basically decided. The Rays, the Yankees in the East, the Indians, White Sox, and Twins in the Central, and the A's and Astros in the West. All those teams have above a 96% chance, according to Fangraphs, of making the playoffs. It's mostly set. There's only really one spot open. And right now, there's a very clear front runner for that one spot, too, because the Blue Jays have an 80% chance of making the playoffs. They're that 8th seed. And, whether they're actually the 8th seed or the 7th seed, that's not the point. They're that 8th team. There's only one other team. There's those 8 teams, the 7 teams, the Blue Jays. Aside from them, there's only one other AL team with an above 3% chance of making the playoffs. Essentially, that 8th spot is either going to 80% chance of going to the Blue Jays and a 20% chance of going to the Tigers, who we talked about. And that's it. The Orioles, 3%. The Red Sox, under 1%. The Royals, 2%. The Rangers, 1.4%. The Mariners, 1.3%. The Angels, 0.6%. The AL playoff field is basically set with only, as far as the teams that are making it, not necessarily the seeding, as far as the teams that are making the playoffs in the American League, it's basically set. There's really only one spot being battled for, and the Blue Jays have an 80% chance of getting it. Essentially. And that's a simplified way of looking at it. So an interesting observation, it doesn't surprise me now that I think about it, because the AL, there's always those teams. It's very much I'm losing the word that I'm trying to come up with, but there's very much there's the extremes. You've got the extreme, in the AL more so than the NL, and especially, I could have predicted that a little bit, but particularly this year, there's the really, really, really good teams, and then there's the really, really, really bad teams. There's not as much in the middle teams like in the NL. When you look and see the Orioles, the Red Sox, they're just not having it. The Royals, they're not not competent. And then in the AL West, you've got the Rangers, Mariners, and Angels. They're just not good. There's more teams that are just very bad and not going to make the playoffs in the AL. And that's going to lead to then more teams that are really good at the top that are set to make the playoffs. So an interesting observation there. The AL playoff field, with about a month to go and only technically about a little over halfway into the season, is basically set. I don't have any sort of great takeaway from that, other than just to highlight that it's pretty set. So an interesting observation. All right, almost out of time here on the broadcast today. We quickly want to go through our What's on Deck segment. This afternoon, we've got an interesting game, not necessarily in terms of both teams being contenders, but a good pitching matchup. Lance Lynn against Zach Greinke, Rangers at Astros. We've already got a game in action in the top of the second. Cubs Pirates are scoreless. This weekend, a lot of different games because of double headers, makeup games, and a lot of series with some playoff implications in terms of both teams being potential playoff contenders. The Twins and Tigers play 5 games against each other over the next 4 days, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday. So the Twins they're the 3rd in the AL Central standings. They're looking to get back up in those AL Central standings. And then you've got the Tigers, who have that about 20% chance of making the playoffs. They can't afford to have a horrible series against the Twins. A couple other interesting series. We've got, this one's not all that interesting. A 4-game series, though. It's Yankees at Baltimore. The Orioles still with an outside shot of making the playoffs. I don't see it. But the Yankees trying to get things on track here. They're trying to catch the Rays. I don't think they're going to catch the Rays, but they're trying to make some headway there. We've got Miami at Tampa Bay with the 3-game series this weekend. The Marlins, big weekend for them because the rest of the way until they're really out of it are big weekends for the Marlins. We'll see if they can. They're playing a great team in the Rays, so we'll see how that plays out. Rivalry games this weekend: Cardinals at Cubs, Rockies at Dodgers. One to watch out in the NL West. It's more about the Dodgers are best team in baseball by miles, but it's more about watching the Rockies and their, do they still, in their shot at making the playoffs. They've still got a shot, so we'll see what they do this weekend against a great Dodgers team. Finally, San Diego at Oakland. That's a fun one this weekend. Interleague game there. Padres at the A's. That'll be a fun one to keep track of and see what happens in that series. So that's just a brief look at what's on deck, and that is our show for today. Thanks for watching Around the Bases here on this Thursday, September 3rd. As always, 110 Sports live coverage continues throughout the week. The J Mole Show with you, with Josh Mullenix, back tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern, and again on Monday. And then on Tuesday, as always, Touchline Talk with Josh Doring at 11 a.m. Eastern. Around the Bases back with you at 1 Eastern on Tuesday. Make sure to go to 110sportsmedia.com for all the very latest. Our shows are available there. Links to our podcasts. We've got multiple podcasts going. You can get those links there as well. And all of our written content. And the simplest way, additionally, in addition to just going to the website, is when you're on the website, right side of the homepage, subscribe to the 110 Sports newsletter. You get the latest written content and links to all our shows, podcasts, and much more in your inbox every Friday morning. So that's a great idea to get all your 110 Sports coverage. We have multiple podcasts coming out in the next couple of days as well, heading into the weekend. A lot of NBA talk on the Jays for Days podcast, of course, and then on the bonfire this week. So stay tuned for that in the couple of days ahead, heading into your weekend. As always, have a great weekend. Stay safe on this Labor Day weekend, and I will talk to you again on Tuesday.